Roz Kincaid signed her divorce papers that morning, then took her 6-year-old son Bennett to Mardi Gras at Jackson Square, hoping New Orleans could drown out their heartbreak. But in the crowd, a masked stranger pressed an envelope into her hand and whispered, "If I disappear, take this to the Times-Picayune." Seconds later, panic erupted. Roz found Bennett safe, and he never spoke again. Now his only words are drawings of the Crescent City connection at 2 p.m., and the man who can decode them swore he would never go back. What would you do if your child's silence was a warning? On the morning, Rosalind Kincaid signed her divorce papers at Orleans Civil District Court on Loyola Avenue. She told herself she would not let the day turn into a memorial. She folded the copy of the judgment into her leather tote, thanked her attorney with a professionalism that felt almost rehearsed, and drove her silver Honda CR-V toward the French Quarter. Mardi Gras had already wrapped itself around the city, and Jackson Square was filling fast by the time she parked near Decatur Street. Bennett held her hand as they crossed toward St. Louis Cathedral, his small fingers sticky from powdered sugar, because she had given in, and bought him beignets from Café du Monde, the paper bag folded twice to keep the sugar from spilling into her purse. "You see, it's like a parade that never ends," she told him, forcing brightness into her voice. Bennett nodded, watching a group of masked performers move past. Roz kept checking her phone, an iPhone 13 with 3 unread emails from clients who did not know she had just dismantled her marriage. She told herself this was what resilience looked like, showing up anyway, standing under the cathedral spires with her son and pretending the ache in her chest could be drowned out by celebration. The stranger came from her left, too close, too sudden. He wore a half-mask painted gold and green, and his hand closed around hers as if they already knew each other. Roz's first instinct was irritation, the reflex of a woman used to setting boundaries. Then she felt paper pressed into her palm. "If I disappear, take this to the Times-Picayune," he whispered, the words barely audible. His breath smelled of coffee and something metallic, fear perhaps. "Excuse me," she said, pulling her hand back, but he was already stepping away, swallowed by sequins and laughter. Roz looked down at the envelope, plain, creased, her name written in block letters she did not recognize. She almost shoved it into the nearest trash can. Instead, she slipped it into her tote, meaning to deal with it later. A second later, the mood shifted. Someone shouted, bodies pushed forward, then backward. Roz lost her footing and tightened her grip on Bennett's hand, except she was suddenly holding air. "Bennett!" she called, the word cracking in her throat. The crowd moved like a single organism, and she was no longer sure which direction was safe. Panic has a way of erasing logic. Roz pushed through shoulders and costumes, ignoring the protests of strangers as she searched for a glimpse of her son's navy hoodie. "Have you seen a little boy, 6, brown hair?" she asked a woman clutching a plastic cup of beer. The woman shook her head. Roz's heart slammed against her ribs with a force that felt punishing. For a terrifying stretch of seconds, she imagined the worst, imagined the headlines she had once coached other families through. Then she spotted him crouched behind a vendor cart near the iron fence, his hands over his ears, eyes wide but dry. She dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms so tightly he winced. "I've got you, I've got you," she murmured, kissing his hair, checking his arms, his face, his breathing. He did not cry. He did not cling back. He simply stared at her as if she were speaking a language he had forgotten. "Ben, talk to me," she said softly. "Say something." He blinked. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The noise around them resumed its careless rhythm, but something between them had gone silent. They left the quarter sooner than planned. In the car, Roz kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, waiting for the delayed tears, the complaint, the question. Bennett stared out at the passing buildings along Rampart Street, hands folded in his lap. "That was scary, right?" she tried. "But you were brave. You stayed put." No response. At a red light, she turned fully in her seat. "Bennett, honey, can you tell Mommy what happened?" The word Mommy hung there, unanswered. He met her eyes, then looked away. At home in their uptown townhouse, she knelt in front of him again, smoothing his hair back the way she used to when he was smaller. "You can whisper if you want. You can be mad. Just talk." He touched her cheek briefly, a gesture that might have been comfort, then walked to the living room and sat on the floor with his Lego box. The pieces clicked together in steady concentration, towers rising without commentary. Roz stood in the doorway and felt a fear more precise than the one in the square. This was not shock that would dissolve with time. This was something closing, deliberately, and she did not know how to pry it open. After he went to bed, still without a word, Roz took the envelope from her tote and laid it on the kitchen counter beside the divorce papers. For a moment she considered leaving it sealed, pretending the day's strangeness had ended at Jackson Square. Instead, she slit it open with a butter knife. Inside were photocopies, handwritten notes, and a list of names she recognized from local business pages, including one tied to a development project near the Mississippi River. There were dates, times, and a reference to the Crescent City connection. At the bottom of one page, scrawled in a hurried hand, was a sentence that made her stomach drop. "They pay to keep it quiet." Roz sank into a chair and read everything twice. This was not a prank. It felt urgent, dangerous, the kind of material that could ignite something bigger than a parade day scare. Her instinct was to call someone at the Times-Picayune immediately, but another instinct, older and more maternal, told her to lock the door and check on her son. She stood beside Bennett's bed and watched him sleep, one hand curled near his face. "It's just a phase," she whispered to the dark room, as if the air might answer. In the morning, she would call his pediatrician at Oxner Medical Center, she decided. She would schedule evaluations, ask about trauma responses, do what competent mothers do. She leaned down and brushed her lips against his forehead. "Good night, sweetheart." He stirred, eyes fluttering open for a second. She waited, holding her breath, certain the word Mom would come back to her like a returned echo. It did not. His gaze passed over her, soft but distant, and he rolled onto his side. Roz straightened slowly, the weight of the envelope and the weight of that silence settling into the same space inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she understood that no argument, no polished statement, no perfectly chosen phrase could fix what had broken. She was facing a silence she could not negotiate. Unable to ignore the envelope and unable to reach her son, Roz did what she always did when a problem refused to yield, she researched. At her kitchen table with her MacBook open and the Times-Picayune website glowing on the screen, she searched old bylines until she found Malachi Sutter's name attached to a photo series from years ago about corruption tied to riverfront contracts. The last public trace of him ended abruptly. A former colleague at the paper, now cautious and vague, gave her a tip. "He drives a Crown Vic now," the man said over the phone, lowering his voice as if someone could overhear through fiber optic cable. "You'll find him near the French Quarter. He works the Decatur and Canal Loop." The next afternoon, Roz buckled Bennett into her silver Honda CR-V and drove toward Canal Street. She spotted the car easily, a weathered 2011 Ford Crown Victoria with peeling city taxi decals and a cracked dashboard. Malachi stood beside it, sleeves rolled, reading a folded newspaper. When she approached, He looked up slowly, studying her before she even spoke. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," he said. She held out the envelope instead of offering her name. He did not reach for it immediately. "Is this about you?" he asked quietly. "Or about the kid?" Roz hesitated, then said, "It's about both." She explained the stranger in Jackson Square, the panic, the silence that followed. Malachi listened without interrupting, his eyes flicking once toward Bennett, who stood close to Roz's leg and refused to meet his gaze. "He hasn't said a word since," Roz finished. "Not at home, not at school. His teacher at Audubon Charter called me yesterday. She thinks it's shock." Malachi nodded but did not agree. "Shock doesn't usually last like that," he said. He finally took the envelope, scanning the first page. A muscle in his jaw tightened at one of the names. "You brought this to the wrong man," he murmured, then corrected himself. "Or maybe the only one who will tell you the truth." Roz bristled. "I don't need philosophy," she said. "I need my son back." He met her stare evenly, then stopped trying to drag him there. The words landed harder than she expected. "You can't force him back to words," Malachi continued. "You have to learn to listen without them." Roz opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Bennett tugged at her sleeve, not to speak, but to point at the Crown Vic. Malachi unlocked the back door with a worn key fob and gestured inside. "Sit," he told Bennett gently. The boy climbed in without protest, pulling a small spiral notebook from Roz's tote. Roz followed, feeling the cramped space press around them. The car smelled faintly of old coffee and paper. Malachi slid into the driver's seat but did not start the engine. "No one is going anywhere yet," he said. "Let him be." Bennett gripped a pencil and began to draw. At first, Roz leaned forward, ready to comment, ready to interpret. Malachi lifted a hand slightly, not touching her, just signaling pause. Bennett sketched 2 tall lines connected by a curve, then another, then water beneath. He erased, redrew, darkened the edges. His brow furrowed with concentration that felt deliberate. "He likes bridges," Roz said softly, almost apologetic. "We drove over one last summer in Biloxi." Malachi did not answer. Bennett drew the shape again on a new page, then tapped the corner of the paper twice and held up 2 fingers. He pressed them down on the page as if stamping a time. Roz felt her throat tighten. 2 o'clock, she whispered. Bennett did not nod, but he did not look away either. Malachi reached back carefully, taking the notebook as if it were fragile evidence. His face changed as soon as he saw the details, the length of the spans, the angle of the cables. "That's not Biloxi," he said quietly. "That's the Crescent City connection." The name sat heavy in the car. Roz had crossed it countless times without thinking, driving west over the Mississippi when traffic on I-10 grew impossible. "It's just a bridge," she began, but Malachi shook his head. "Not to me." He handed the notebook back to Bennett with surprising tenderness. "Last time I stood on that bridge with a camera," he said, eyes fixed ahead, "I took a photo that cost me everything." Roz studied him, noticing for the first time the way he avoided looking at the skyline when the river was mentioned. "What did you photograph?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. A meeting that wasn't supposed to happen, tied to a contract the city later pretended was clean. He glanced at the envelope in his hand. Some of those names are the same. Roz felt anger rising, not at him, but at the invisible web tightening around them. "So this is connected," she said. "The stranger, the bridge, the notes." Malachi did not soften the truth. "If your son drew that without being told, then yes, it's connected. Bennett tapped the page again, firmer this time, then looked at Malachi as if waiting for recognition. Something passed between them that Roz could not fully decode. "He's not broken," Malachi said quietly, almost to himself. "He's trying to tell you something." Roz swallowed hard. "I've been asking him to talk," she admitted. "Begging, bargaining. I even promised him a Nintendo Switch if he said one word." Malachi allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "Kids don't respond well to negotiations," he said. "Trust me." He shifted in his seat, suddenly more guarded. "The Crescent City connection isn't somewhere I go anymore." His voice tightened, not dramatic, just final. Roz understood then that the envelope had not simply led her to a taxi driver. It had led her to a man who had already lost once on that bridge. Roz looked at Bennett, who was now tracing the bridge outline with slow, careful strokes, reinforcing it as if afraid it might disappear. "We have to go there, don't we?" she said softly. It was not a question about geography. Malachi rested his hands on the steering wheel without turning the key. For a long moment he did not answer. Finally he said, "If we do it my way. No reporters yet, no calls. We watch first." Roz studied him, weighing instinct against fear. She nodded. "Your way," she agreed. Bennett closed the notebook and held it against his chest. In that cramped back seat of a worn Crown Vic, Roz felt the shift happen, subtle but undeniable. The envelope had not just brought her to Malachi Sutter. It had pulled him back toward the Crescent City connection, toward the exact place he had sworn he would never return. Under a low, humid sky, the Crown Vic rolled up the approach toward the Crescent City connection, merging from Tchoupitoulas Street with a patience that felt unnatural for Roz. She kept the envelope on her lap, fingers pressed along its edge as if it might slide away. Bennett sat forward in the back seat, eyes fixed on the flow of cars heading west over the Mississippi. He was not fidgeting, not afraid, just intensely alert, as if tracking something invisible. Malachi drove without the radio on, both hands steady on the worn steering wheel. "We circle once," he said quietly. "No sudden moves." Roz nodded, though her pulse refused to match his calm. She checked the time on her iPhone, 1:57 p.m. Bennett tapped the notebook in his lap twice, the same way he had in the Crown Vic days earlier. 2, she whispered to herself. Traffic slowed as they reached the span, trucks rumbling beside them. Roz scanned the shoulder and the pedestrian access below, searching for anything that matched the urgency in the notes. She told herself she was imagining patterns, that fear could create meaning where none existed. Then she saw them. At exactly 2:00 p.m., 2 men stood near the lower access road by the riverbank, too composed to be casual, their posture rigid in a way that betrayed intent. A third vehicle, a black Chevrolet Tahoe with tinted windows, idled nearby. Roz felt the recognition hit her before she understood why. The Tahoe matched the description scribbled in the margin of the envelope, partial plate numbers circled twice. "Malachi," she said, her voice thin. He followed her gaze without overreacting. "I see it," he replied. Bennett leaned forward, pressing his palm against the glass, eyes locked on the men below. One of them checked his watch. The other adjusted his jacket, revealing the edge of a folder tucked inside. The moment stretched, and Roz understood with a clarity that left no room for denial. The envelope had not been entrusted to her for safety. It had been placed in her hand to draw someone out. She was not a witness by accident. She was part of the setup. "It's bait," she breathed. Malachi did not contradict her. "Yes," he said softly, as if he had known all along. Instead of accelerating away, Malachi guided the Crown Vic down toward the lower road, keeping enough distance to appear ordinary. "Stay calm," he murmured, though it sounded more like a plea than instruction. Roz's instincts screamed at her to protect Bennett, to turn around, to retreat to Uptown and lock every door. Yet she did not move. She watched as another man approached the Tahoe, exchanging a brief handshake with one of the two waiting figures. It was quick, deliberate, the kind of meeting meant to leave no trace. Malachi reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an old Nikon DSLR, its body scratched but intact. "I swore I'd never do this again," he said under his breath, lifting the camera to eye level. Roz glanced at him. "Then don't," she whispered. He lowered the camera for a second, meeting her gaze. "If I don't, this stays buried." That was the subtext she could not ignore. He adjusted the lens and began shooting through the windshield, capturing the exchange of the folder, the handshake, the Tahoe's license plate. Each click felt like defiance against years of silence. The men below moved with efficiency, unaware they were being documented. One opened the folder, scanning its contents, then nodded. Roz felt her throat tighten. "Those are the names," she said, recognizing a face from the development proposal she had once reviewed for a client. The envelope in her lap seemed to burn. Suddenly, one of the men looked up, scanning the area. His gaze lingered on the Crown Vic for half a beat too long. "He sees us," Roz whispered. Malachi lowered the camera without panicking. "Seatbelt," he told her. Bennett had already fastened his. The Tahoe's engine revved, and in the same instant Malachi eased the Crown Vic forward, blending into the slow traffic climbing back toward the bridge. A horn blared behind them as a pickup truck cut too close. Roz twisted in her seat, watching the Tahoe pull out. For a second she thought it would follow. It did not. It turned in the opposite direction, disappearing toward the west bank. Only when they rejoined the main flow toward US 90 did Roz allow herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the dashboard to steady them. They exited near Chupitulas and pulled under the shadowed space beneath the bridge, parking near a row of concrete supports where fishermen sometimes set up folding chairs. Malachi placed the camera on his lap and stared at it as if it was something alive. "That's the shot," he said quietly. "Clear enough to matter." Roz wiped at her eyes, surprised to find tears there. "You were right," she admitted. "It was connected," he nodded once. "I took a similar photo years ago. Same kind of meeting, different faces, same pattern. I published it, and the fallout cost me my job, my credibility. They said I manipulated the image." His jaw tightened. It was easier to drive a taxi than fight a machine. Roz listened without interrupting. The admission was not dramatic, it was tired. "You didn't deserve that," she said. He shrugged slightly. "Maybe I did. I thought truth was enough." He glanced back at Bennett, who was watching them with an intensity that felt older than 6. Roz reached for Malachi's hand without overthinking it. "Don't disappear," she said, the words slipping out before she could polish them. "I can't do this alone." He looked at her fingers wrapped around his and did not pull away. "I'm not planning to," he answered. In the back seat, Bennett leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently against Malachi's arm, a quiet gesture that seemed instinctive. For a heartbeat, they all stayed like that, suspended between fear and something softer. Then Bennett made a small sound, barely more than a breath shaped into tone. It was fragile, uncertain, but undeniably intentional. Roz turned toward him slowly. "It's okay," she whispered, Tears falling freely now, she took both their hands, her son's and Malachi's, and held them together. "No more disappearing," she said, not just to Bennett, not just to Malachi, but to herself. Malachi met her eyes and gave the only answer that mattered. "I stay." What did you feel when Bennett went silent after Jackson Square and his drawings became the only way to warn his mom? Tell us in the comments, do you think Roz should trust Malachi even knowing the Crescent City connection is the one place he swore he'd never return to? On a scale from 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story so far? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next chapter is where the truth stops hiding.